Hi, it's Joy and today I'm going to be watching The Clone Wars Season 3, Episode 5, Corruption, which does not sound promising. We have finally, well not finally, but we have reached Season 3, the kind of Season 3-ish arc. I know that they go all over the place a little bit, but we're at Season 3 now, and I'm excited to continue exploring this very stressful time period in the galaxy. But yes, a reminder that you can find the unedited version of this reaction on my Patreon, along with all my reactions. You get the unedited 2 weeks in advance, the edited 1 week in advance, and let's go. I was not expecting this to be a Mandalorian episode.
I had hoped to show you the new Mandalore.
Ooh.
Not the before the others.
Goodness. Well, it's really sad knowing that this this planet is gonna fall. Especially if they're having like a golden age of happiness.
We are a people of tradition.
That's kind of an unsettling way to land, I can't lie. Oh no, who are you? Black market traders?
Deal with me directly in the future, got it?
Good way to keep your pockets lined. Though I mean, if they're a planet that is currently struggling from supply shortages, as long as that stuff's trustworthy, I doubt her stress.
Trade Federation make a profit whether our business is legitimate or not.
I resent that.
This is going swimmingly.
New trade routes are essential to survival, but the black market is no substitute for legitimate and legal trade.
What would you propose?
It is if it's the only option.
I told Senator Amidala that Mandalore was not part of the wall, yet here I find a battle in my own palace.
Well, yeah.
This meeting adjourned.
It's a very fraught time at the moment. Even if you're neutral in a war, no one escapes any consequences of it.
Isn't it toxic? Only if the dosage is wrong.
Oh, great.
Mixture, right.
How do you feel about the Republic's war with the Separatists?
I love it.
Too many senators serving their own interests.
Yeah.
There are still
Politics everywhere is just not great.
Tomorrow you and I shall visit.
So corrupt and self-interest.
It will do us good.
Are they going to see an influx of people who've had this diluted tea and are poisoned?
We've gotten reports from across the planet.
How far did that stuff spread?
Well, the testing their food.
In their drink.
Perhaps we can create an antidote.
All he thinks about is politics. Well, we can't just sit here and do nothing. My thoughts exactly.
Good.
Thank you all for coming. I suppose you're wondering why
She's changed into her action clothes. Both of them have. Oh god, it's on all of their desks.
About their drinks, Doctor.
No, they drink fresh water. It's impossible for it to be tainted.
Not the water. What about the
Like, what are you talking about?
Out of the school's menu, I must borrow your drink.
They didn't think to test the drinks. I would be getting some other people in charge of these schools.
must have an import log, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And maybe go run into the canteen and stop all the kids drinking it.
Came from. Well, then let's get to the docks.
And maybe put out an alert, don't drink this stuff. Goodness.
Everything is here, Satine.
It is interesting to this is really exploring the consequences of being neutral, of just being a planet in a war zone. Oof.
They offered me a great deal.
Yeah.
I could keep some money for myself too, but I didn't know that the drinks were poison.
All this because you were greedy?
Corruption.
Most people turn a blind eye to anything else.
We are
You've
not
poisoned children accidentally.
So I'll play your little game. I'm sorry there are sick children, I truly am.
Why does he have this accent?
Where do you get the tea? During your tenure as queen, you became quite familiar with such excursions.
And
You
since.
can only survive.
Surely they could have a few more guards.
There's a shipment arriving.
Really? Yep. You've just signed yourself a prison sentence. Good job.
What you're saying, it's impossible.
Impossible.
Yeah, I don't think it's impossible.
I'm always watching.
Where were you last night?
And were you watching as children were dying? Who was
Have they died?
Duchess, with all
I command you, open these doors.
They weren't paid enough for this. Oh my goodness. What a stupid, like, you're a bit outnumbered. Oof. If I was one of the minions that they treat abysmally, I would surrender. How are the
I
children?
want you to burn down this warehouse.
Excuse me? Burn the warehouse.
That's a bit weird. I mean, there's evidence. Why do we need it burnt down?
Oh, I'm glad this is over.
No, I'm afraid it's not over.
No.
The corruption we witnessed is intolerable.
With this episode, if you took a shot every time I said the word corruption, you would be very
I'm
drunk.
sorry, I'm setting up a committee to...
You need to sort out trade routes. That has to be a priority. Come on, people.
Trouble, Padme. Perhaps a Jedi working
Ooh.
at the Academy could be of service to us, and in more ways than one. For if we lose our young, Mandalore will indeed be lost.
Mandalore, not much time left. I'm not surprised she wasn't like, perhaps if Obi-Wan could come. No reason. Okay, this was a really interesting episode in the sense that it's not going to ever be like the best episode ever or one of the favourite episodes. I love seeing more of Mandalore, kind of getting the backstory of where we are now in the Mandalorian, though obviously I know that he's part of the like super extreme version of the Death Watch rather than even just the one we've seen. But just seeing more of Mandalore as a planet, because I've heard so much about it, is always fascinating. But I think what this episode did really, really well was this show is brilliant as this show brilliantly shows the realities of wars on ordinary people combined to the soldiers fighting it. Like, they kind of show all different avenues of war and how it can affect people. But in this case, we're seeing a real example of a planet that has politically successfully managed to be neutral. I assume there's nothing there that the Separatists particularly want, so they're fairly safe. But even though you're neutral from the fighting, even though your people aren't having to go through the trauma and the fighting of war, you can still be affected because the trade routes aren't secure. I'm kind of unclear in this episode as to whether like the Republican people have intentionally stopped trade routes, like, you're not going to help us, fine, you don't get our trade, or whether it's just the nature of war, the nature of these battles that are going on all around the galaxy means that trade routes get disrupted and there is no guaranteed safe travel. I mean, if you think about during like the World Wars with U-boats in the Atlantic and the Pacific, or maybe the Atlantic, get targeting, you know, cargo ships, customs ships, targeting cargo ships and things because you want to try and stop supplies getting to a place. Now that was more people who were at war, but I guess it's kind of a mixture of the two, that like just the sort of more self-interested, self-important, well, if I'm not getting anything out of this, screw you people in the Republic might put Mandalore as, okay, if you're going to be independent, fuck off, who cares? Whereas there will also be people who, while they might want to send ships, if there is fighting in nearby, if there are separatist ships in the area, it's just not worth it. So I thought that was a really interesting kind of angle we haven't quite explored yet. The concept of Mandalore's neutrality is an interesting one. Now, I do understand, I think people on YouTube have left me a few comments that were quite useful, like kind of pointing out that Mandalore had almost been in a constant state of war for such a long time, for like hundreds of years, that this time of peace was a really significant thing. It's a big deal on Mandalore. And so to kind of, for them to reach this age of peace at the same time as the galaxy is exploding in a war, the last thing they'd want to do is take their internal war and continue having to fight it out there in the rest of the world. I think this would definitely be something that would be a contentious issue. There would be some people who would want to fight to make sure Mandalore is safe. There would be people that would want to fight if they thought, okay, yeah, but the Separatists are bad, they're doing things that are wrong, we should go and fight. But, you know, there are countries in the real world that have stayed neutral throughout wars, where countries are committing atrocities, and I don't think it's right or wrong. I think there is definitely an argument to be had that if you could go and help people less fortunate than you who are being invaded, and you just sit there twiddling your thumbs, being like, we're right here, that isn't great. But at the same time, if you have a what's the word? Sorry, my CFS, I have brain fog. Sometimes words just elude me and it really drives me insane. My memory used to be something I was like really good with. But you have a responsibility to your people to not just get involved in conflicts that aren't directly affecting you and shipping them out to die. I can definitely also see why that isn't selfish. That is just looking out for yourselves, and especially for Mandalore when they've just been in this time of conflict. So there's definitely two sides, which we've really discussed in the previous ones about that. But the consequence of that for them is trade, that they don't have as much in the way of supplies. Now, perhaps something they should look into is, why are they so dependent on trade? Is it to do with their nature of their biome and their planet? They seem to have to live under these like bubbles rather than on the ground itself. But is there some way they could become more self-sustainable so that were this to happen in the future, they'd be okay? and they do need to try and get more trade routes up. Now, Padme is right, there are people like her, there are people who are good, who care, that will want to try and do things for Mandalore, but there's no guarantee in wartime. So it's a really just interesting dynamic. And then you have the people, now this episode, like I said, if you took a drink every time they said corrupt or corruption, we would all be too drunk, blackout drunk. I would not remember this episode at all. But it raised a good point that in every society, in every avenue. I mean, if you look at the Tories, Boris Johnson got Tory donors to pay for his flat, to pay for his holiday. You know, throughout this pandemic, Tories were getting their family and friends, companies that have just appeared, giving them contracts for millions of pounds to do all this stuff with PPE and ignoring people that could have done it but actually were there. Like, there was so much corruption in politics in the real world, and that's just in the UK, forget Trump and everything there. That of course there will be corruption, and people will there are always people who take advantage of every situation. That's why if you are in a position of authority or in a position of being the overwatch over like customs or whatever, you can't just sit back and be like, oh, my people are good, they wouldn't be corrupt like that guy was. You have to make sure they aren't being corrupt. You need to really have people registering what ships come in unannounced and all that kind of thing, and have oversight. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, it's people in a slightly different kind of comparison. When you watch cop shows and then like an IA investigator comes in, people are always like, oh, it's the rat squad. And it's like, no, if you've not done anything wrong, you shouldn't have anything to worry about. That should be the motto, the method that we live by. Obviously, yeah, you can still have people who are corrupt within the Overwatch, but then they also need to be like, you know, kind of just everyone needs to keep each other honest, and just no one should get a free pass because of their position or because, you know, oh, they're a good person. The fact that, like, they even made a point of the guy being like, but this could be poisonous, make sure you get it right. And then they were like, yeah, that'll do, I'll ship it out to all the schools. You'd think you'd test it first, like take one sample bottle and be like, not poisoned. I mean, or maybe make one, I don't know, like, I guess none of them would want to risk it. But the very fact that they were so careless with making sure it wasn't poisonous to try and get that little bit of extra money by diluting it and making more meant that they got caught, because the kids all got poisoned. Whereas if they'd not done that, if they just shipped out their stuff, you know, with less of the solution, so less diluted, or with none of the solution ideally, they could still be making their profit and they could still be living very happily ever after instead of being dead or in prison. So it shows you that corruption doesn't pay, and that also when people put greed ahead of other people, they put themselves first. You really need to reflect who you are as a person, because that guy with his weird accent, who was like the trade guy, who was all like, oh yeah, I'm fine, I have nothing to do with this, I'm totally safe from all of this. He was totally fine with lining his pockets while kids suffered, and he didn't care about that. It definitely shows you there are people can be terrible. I thought the line that Sabine had of like, money is the worst weapon in this galaxy, and like, true, but I do also think like nukes pretty bad too. The money is more insidious, it's dangerous on a lower level, it affects everyday people as well as like the generals and the soldiers or whatever. So this was an interesting episode. It kind of gives you a lot to think about, even if it's not going to be one that will stick in my memory as being like the best episode or anything. But I did enjoy it, and it raised some interesting points that I hope I have discussed somewhat coherently. I am having like, the last couple of weeks, my brain fog has been worse, so I don't know how existent I am. Words. A reminder that you can find the unedited version of this reaction on my Patreon. You get this 2 weeks in advance, the edited version 1 week in advance, and thank you so much for watching. It really means a lot.